Great. So yeah, hello and welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the Managing Director of the World Forum Offshore Wind, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to today's exciting webinar, which is on Offshore Wind Reflections on 2020 and the way forward. And with our two fantastic speakers with us today, Richard Sandford, Director Offshore Development Europe at RWE Renewables, and David Povall, Executive Vice President Development at Northland Power. So welcome, Richard and David. Really looking forward to this webinar. And before we go into the discussion, let me just tell you a few words about WFO. And as you can see on the next slide, so we are a non-profit organization founded in 2018, focusing exclusively on offshore wind energy. And our members represent the complete offshore wind value chain. And we, of course, have an international setup with offices in Hamburg and Singapore. And if we have a quick look at our activities, it's very straightforward. It's three things. We lobby for offshore wind on a global scale. We inform about offshore wind via all our media channels and databases. And we connect the global offshore wind community via events, workshops, networking opportunities. So always trying to bring together people from different countries and regions. If we look at our members, you can see what a great range of members we have in terms of industry background and location as well. So members from North America, Asia Pacific, and Europe. And of course, always looking forward to bringing more members on board. If you're not a member of WFO yet, please make sure to join us. You can find all information on our website or on our social media channels, Twitter and LinkedIn. So yeah, make sure to check out WFO and join us, of course, as a member as soon as possible. And yeah, I think that is now the point where we take it to Richard for his opening remarks on reflections on 2020 and the way forward. So Richard, over to you. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Gunnar, and hello to everybody, depending on what time zone you're in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, real honour to be asked to work with the WFO and to reflect on my thoughts on 2020, a year that will certainly go down in history for the obvious reason. I'm going to try and steer clear of that topic initially. I'm sure it will come up in our discussions. And when I think back or think, over the last 12 months on 2020, I think it's been a really impressive year for setting targets. So it's been a year where we've seen some really exciting announcements from government, from industry, committing to net zero, setting carbon reduction targets, setting renewable energy targets, and I guess really importantly for us, setting offshore wind targets. So I guess when we look back at the net zero discussions, and I think it probably started back in 2017 with Sweden committing to become net zero by 2045. And then in 2019, other countries followed suit, committing to net zero by 2050. So we had the UK, France, Denmark, New Zealand. And then in 2020, we saw Hungary making the same commitments. Impressively, China committing to net zero by 2060. Japan and South Korea the same. So really encouraging to see these large nations committing to net zero. And net zero is without question absolutely critical. But the good news is that I believe it's absolutely possible. It's going to be a challenge, but it's something which is really possible. And we've seen companies making similar commitments. Last year, my company, RWE, set the ambitious target to become carbon neutral by 2040. And for RWE, this was a huge landmark moment in our history. I think in the past, we were known as probably one of the most carbon intensive power producers in Europe. So to commit to get carbon neutral, negative, zero carbon by 2040 is something that I'm particularly proud of. And 2020, I think, was the year where we really saw this journey taking place. So we created the company RWE Renewables, which was the merger of two large renewable players, E.ON Climate and Renewables and Innogy Renewables, the company that I was in. Brought these two companies together during 2020 to now become one of the world leaders in renewable energy. I think we're number 2 in the world when it comes to offshore wind, and some huge investment plans. By the end of 2022, we're planning on investing at least 5 billion euros net to expand our renewable portfolio, and obviously go through a process of closing down coal and gas-fired power plant. So something I'm incredibly proud of, and great to see our company and many other companies committing to the net zero. But net zero is only going to be possible with offshore wind. And I think 2020 has been a fantastic year for seeing so many countries, so many governments committing some really impressive targets to offshore wind. I'm going to focus on Europe. That's the area that I cover within RWE. So I'm going to focus my thoughts more around what's been going on in Europe. I mean, the EU has set a target of 60 gigawatts by 2030 of offshore wind, and they've set a really impressive target right out to 2050, 300 gigawatts of offshore wind. And many of the countries within Europe have made equally as impressive commitments. Germany committed to 20 gigawatts by 2030, the Netherlands 11.5 gigawatts, Ireland 5 gigawatts, Poland a nice phased approach, 3 gigawatts by 2025, 10 gigawatts by 2030, and then I think it's 28 gigawatts by 2050. And then the UK, my home market, 40 gigawatts by 2030. I'd like to just spend a few moments just thinking about what's happened in the UK. So it was only a couple of months ago, in October, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson set out some rather impressive plans, I think, to invest further in UK offshore wind. And he's got an ambition that the UK is absolutely at the forefront of what he's calling the green industrial revolution, which is all about, again, taking this journey to net zero. So at the moment, many of you will know that the UK actually has more installed capacity than any other country in the world. At the moment, we've got about 10 gigawatts of installed capacity. So to increase that to 40 gigawatts, that's quadrupling our installed capacity in the next 10 years, which is fantastic news for all of us in the industry. The UK has made a pledge for floating as well, an ambition to have 1 gigawatt of floating by 2030. And to really kickstart this journey, the next CFD auction, AR4 as it's known, they've doubled the capacity in that auction. So that's really impressive, and it is really vital. You know, this green recovery is really important. Our economies have really been hit with the coronavirus. I said I wouldn't mention it, but there you go. It has been really hit. So this plan is expected to generate, I think, 2,000 construction jobs in the short term, and an additional 60,000 jobs directly and indirectly in the UK alone. So I think it's fantastic to see the UK and other countries setting these ambitious targets in 2020. And indeed, there's been lots of plans to release more areas of the seabed in many countries. You know, the UK Round 4, ScotWind in the UK, and other markets. And we have seen some slippage in the programme there, a couple of months here and there, but essentially it's setting us up in the right way, the right aspects, the right things that we need to better take the industry forward. And again, the UK have carried out a programme to extend some of the existing projects. So the Crown Estate that own the seabed awarded 6 agreements for lease to extend 6 current projects in the UK. Really proud that RWE and our project partners secured 4 of those 6. So again, we've got 4 new projects to work on next year. So I think in summary, 2020 for offshore wind has been a really positive year that's really set the standard, set the ambition, set the landscape for us to really take this industry forward and to grow from strength to strength. So they're my initial thoughts of offshore wind in 2020.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, for this very impressive big picture view, and indeed looking very promising with all those ambitious targets in all of the different countries. So yeah, thanks very much. Great, thoughts from your side. And yeah, now it's over to David. Your thoughts and reflections on 2020 so far and the way forward.
Gunnar, thank you, and Richard, thank you for your opening comments. So myself, a quick introduction to myself. So my name is David Povall. I'm the Executive Vice President for Development. So have a global remit for Northland Power, leading the growth, the development business for Northland across the 4 geographies that we operate in across the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. For those less familiar, Northland Power is a Toronto publicly listed company. We are a power producer dedicated to developing, building, owning, and operating clean and green global power infrastructure assets around the world. And we have just about 3 gigawatts, or just under 3 gigawatts operating projects today. So as Gunnar sort of requested, reflect on 2020. And actually, if you go to the next slide, please, Ilya, I'm actually not going to shy away from the obvious comment is, how can you reflect on 2020 without reflecting on the global pandemic, which has obviously impacted all of us significantly. But I suppose most significantly, what was the impact on our industry? So how do we consider the implications of that global pandemic on the governments, the corporations, and I guess the people across the world? Maybe this is not the right forum for this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I think it is a soft factor. We've heard the comments that as we've looked at the skies and the streets without the pollution, as the cars weren't there and the planes weren't flying in the skies, we've all sort of reconnected with nature. We've enjoyed listening to the birds singing in the skies where we hadn't noticed them before. And I think that's a soft side of things which we shouldn't ignore. And so just hold that thought, I think, as we continue through this this discussion. But I suppose, what have we seen in terms of governments and corporations? What have we seen through 2020 in their reactions to this global pandemic? And I've tried to summarize on the slide here, I guess, 4 key themes, and I'm going to start from for some reason, I don't know why, start from the bottom left and work around in a clockwise direction. So I'd like to start off with the first, I guess, idea that governments have seen the green economy as an opportunity for economic recovery. I think it's clear as you look around the world, the number of governments that have recognized, and either they've made very overt statements, and I think the UK is probably one of those which was the most explicit, and Richard identified that, or have certainly made strong indications that they see as the economies need to pull themselves out of the recession, which many are in as a result of the pandemic. They see the green economy, the investment in renewable energy as a core a driver to achieve that. And I think that's hugely exciting for us in this industry, and hopefully everybody listening to the discussion who's operating in the sector. Why? Well, obviously it drives jobs, it drives growth through the investment in infrastructure, and through all that it stimulates a supply chain, and a supply chain obviously through that generates the jobs and the ultimately the taxes that are paid that support governments. So that's my first sort of thesis, that we're seeing the opportunity for economic recovery through our industry. The second takeaway, which I think we've seen announced in 2020, is ambitious government targets, and Richard referred to this before. Gunnar wanted me perhaps to focus a little bit more on Asia, so I'll quote the specifics of what Richard indicated. So we had a new Prime Minister in Japan, Prime Minister Suga, in almost one of his very first announcements to the government, to the Diet in Tokyo, in his policy speech, was Japan's new target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. That's Japan's come a huge way over the last few years in terms of its ambition, both in terms of setting a net zero target, but also in terms of driving offshore wind agenda as part of that. A close neighbor, so in South Korea, the Korean ruling party in November tabled something called the Green Deal Basic Act bill, which aimed to achieve, again, a net zero emission by 2050. So the large economies in Asia competing with net zero targets. And in South Korea, so that went hand in hand with the government announcing a phasing out of the coal generation by 2050, outlined in the draft plan by the Ministry of Environment. So again, this would indicate a need for renewable generation of up to 80% of the total power from about 8% today. So a significant step up, which is a great opportunity for the industry. My third takeaway from 2020, reflection on 2020, is project development has continued. So the challenges, and there's no denying the challenges which many people and industries and countries have faced, but project development has continued through 2020, despite the headwinds that we've all faced. We've seen a number of markets with a continued desire to deploy more renewables. Richard referred to some of those successes, which in the UK. Again, Japan has continued to push forward with its round one, which is auction process for further offshore wind. Taiwan has announced its ambitions for, or its details for its round three, its next wave of offshore wind auction process. So that's continued despite, again, these headwinds which we all faced in 2020. We're still seeing governments pushing forward the agenda to deploy more renewables. And just reflecting on Northland itself, so what have we done in that? So we also have managed to continue to grow our development portfolio through 2020, and announcements have been made expanding our portfolio in not in Asia but out in the US, up in New York, with some additional onshore wind projects, and then more closely at home in Asia, to where I am, in South Korea, with the expansion of our offshore wind assets as part of the Dado Ocean project. So again, some examples from ourselves, but others will be able to continue and follow that trend of the increased deployment of project development of offshore wind. And then finally, my last comment is the increased global investment in renewable energy. So again, we've seen through the year not only a continued investment by the incumbents. So Richard and I represent two of those incumbents in the market today. So we've continued, and this is across both, I guess, development, construction, and continued, I guess, the operating of our offshore wind projects, or wider renewable projects. So we've continued that Northland's continued that in its construction projects. We have some projects in Mexico, solar project under construction that's had some hiccups as part of the challenges to deal with the COVID-19 supply chain issues, but generally remain sort of on schedule to complete successful construction. And again, projects in development, whether they be the Hailong project in Taiwan or those assets we have in Japan and Korea, they've continued through, despite the headwinds of the pandemic, we're able to continue to move those forward. And again, I think that's a common trend across the industry. The other sort of trend as part of this increased global investment in renewable energy is not just the incumbents, but also the new entrants. So we've seen a number of new entrants announce their move into this space, which I take as a huge sort of positive sign and support for the industry we're in. Yes, it will create some competition, but competition's never been a bad thing as far as I'm concerned. And so we've seen that particularly some oil and gas majors I've got the headlines with their investments into the renewable energy sector. So I think that's something that we've seen in 2020 and will continue into 2021. So Gunnar, they were my reflections on 2020.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, David, for those thoughts. And yeah, great to hear also in more detail what some of the upcoming Asian offshore wind markets are looking like. So great to hear that Japan is now really keen on renewables and offshore wind, and South Korea as well. So yeah, thanks very much, David. And yeah, that already brings us to the Q&A session. So during this webinar, we have a nice and long Q&A session. And yeah, just as a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to type in your question into the chat box on your control panel on the right-hand side, and then we'll be happy to try to cover as many questions as possible. And yeah, maybe just to kick things off, first question from my side, yeah, which is about some new upcoming markets. So if you think about, yeah, sort of in addition to the established offshore wind markets like the UK, Denmark, or Germany, which new and upcoming markets do you see maybe in Europe for you, Richard? And then David, which Asian markets do you think might be most promising or looking most promising from today's perspective?
Shall I go first? Thanks, Gunnar. You're right. So there's the obvious markets where offshore wind targets have been set, and we know the ambitions there and things will happen. But there are, again, if I focus on Europe, there are certainly markets in Europe where the potential's there, and there's some signs that things may happen. I think Spain and Italy are potentially a couple of countries to keep an eye on and to see what happens. For me, I'm actually quite excited about the Baltic Sea. A number of countries there, you know, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, as markets they're fairly small, but they've got that the synergies of the Baltic Sea. I think Latvia and Estonia signed an MOU to develop, I think it was a gigawatt of offshore wind. So they're not necessarily going to be huge markets, but I think there's potential in those sorts of clusters. And I think, to be fair, we're going to have some game changers come in. So the hydrogen economy and much more exporting of power. And I think as exporting develops, as the hydrogen economy develops, I think that's going to open up even more markets, and potentially Norway. So Norway have an abundance of very affordable hydropower, green power. They don't need offshore wind. But with exports, with the hydrogen economy, there could well be opportunities. So I think upcoming, you know, future markets, they're the ones I'd be keeping an eye on.
Great, thanks, Richard.
From my perspective on Asia, I guess you might even say that, you know, like the whole of Asia is an upcoming market. It's, you know, and it's compared to many parts of Europe and the UK, as Richard said, its dominance in terms of the number of megawatts installed in offshore wind. The whole of Asia somehow would be my simple answer to that question, but maybe I should go into a little bit more detail. Maybe I see sort of Asia split into a couple of sort of boxes. The first being, let's call them the really sort of emerging, where there's very, very few signs today, but I think that there are some early signs of growth. So perhaps on the emerging markets side, we're starting to see announcements, sort of fairly ambitious targets to enter into the offshore wind space. And particularly seeing that, maybe one I would pick would be Vietnam, where we're starting to see significant renewable energy additions. Now, again, Vietnam, significant onshore renewable capacity today, a great natural resource, incentive schemes which are in place, and already seeing more than about 500 megawatts of offshore wind projects, fairly near-shore offshore wind projects in the pipeline of certain developers, which are expected to come online before the feed-in tariff deadline later at the end of 2021. So some early signs of sort of near-shore, offshore, but I think given the potential, the resource potential that Vietnam has, I think that's one Gunnar, that I would list as a real sort of emerging market within Asia. I think the other one I would add, I would put Japan on there. So it's a little bit more traction, obviously, in Japan today. So not quite the emerging state that Vietnam is. I'm looking forward to a revised energy mix, or energy mix target, which is stated by the government to be released in 2021. So hopefully we'll see the 22 to 24% target for renewables increased, which I think we need to see the government make that statement. And that should be, a real positive signal to build on the success which Japan has managed to stimulate in its interest in offshore wind to date. And so again, hopefully we'll see a journey beyond the 10 gigawatts by 2030, which is generally the number we're working to in Japan. Hopefully we can see ambitions beyond that. And as I think as indicated before, the government has pushed forward with its first round, so the round 1 auction process, which will take place in 2021. So I think that's my second of my attractive markets in Asia, to your question.
Perfect, great. Thanks, David, Richard, for those answers. That sounds very promising. And we are starting to get the first fascinating questions from the audience, actually. And one nicely relates to this, the question we just discussed. So with all that growth and the kind of plans we see from countries in terms of building gigawatts of offshore wind, can the supply chain actually cope with that kind of growth? Or might we see any supply chain bottlenecks, at least maybe in certain regions of the world? Any views on how the supply chain can actually cope with that kind of growth? Is it mainly going to be the existing players? Are we going to see many new suppliers maybe? Any thoughts on supply chain, maybe challenges or the supply chain for offshore wind, given that kind of growth that we're looking at?
Richard, happy for you to go first, or?
Yeah, okay, go on. I'll have a go. I think it's a great question, and it is an obvious point, isn't it? I remember when offshore wind was particularly taking off, around the sort of 2009-10 mark. We were worried about bottlenecks in the supply chain. In fact, we built a couple of installation vessels because we were worried about the availability of installation vessels. As it happened, the industry kept up with growth, and I believe it will. I think it's really important that the industry are sharing plans, so the supply chain have got a good idea of what's coming, where it's going to be. Certainly, we spend a lot of time working with the supply chain, and particularly local supply chains, to really help them understand the opportunities which are upcoming. So, it'd be criminal for companies to miss out on this. So I think they will cope. I think localization on the supply chain is potentially a bit of an issue as well. Every government who has set in targets for offshore wind are really keen to have local content and as much local manufacturing as possible. Every country would love to have a nacelle assembly facility, but that's not credible. That's not doable. So I believe that the supply chain will grow with the industry, but there will be some challenges in that. We will have to be taking the first foundations from a new factory or the first cable from a new factory, whatever it happens to be, which brings with it some risk. But I think the opportunities are great. David, what you'd add? Or
no, Yeah, very much agree with those comments, Richard. And I guess looking at the supply chain from an Asia perspective, it is quite different from a European perspective. It's as you move into, let's say, the Baltic states, at least there's proximity to the supply chain in the rest of Europe, which you'd have to stimulate new countries. In Asia, it's a little different because you're much earlier in the well, maybe very different, or a little different, much earlier in the cycle in terms of establishing the offshore industry. And as many people know, there isn't the oil and gas offshore industry to leverage from, which of course Europe had that advantage all those years ago as it did its first offshore projects. Supply chain, I think of it in two. So I think there is the international supply chain, so let's call them the turbine suppliers. So I think they're still, I think they would, if they were on this call, I think they would say they're still sorting out their own way of dealing with this exponential growth in demand for their product. How are they going to service the project companies, the project developers? So I think that's one part of the supply chain, which I mean, of course they will work out how to do that, but I think that's one challenge the industry faces on the international supply side, and then at a local level. So we talked earlier about government putting targets, and we've quoted some of those. I mean, that is so important as a signal to the supply chain to then make the investment decisions which is going to be required to then service the industry. So I think that's why I always try and say to governments that that's why you have to give these clear targets, because the supply chain can invest behind that. There is, I think, on the theme of sort of Asia establishing itself, I think there is the opportunity for sort of regional hubs. So we've talked about that in terms of what we're trying to do in Taiwan, which the most progressed of the Asian markets. So again, establishing a regional hub there, which we talked about, and the Cell regional hub, Richard, as you say. So that was part of could be stimulated through the Hai Long project. Is established that the regional hub for nacelle, which could then, of course, export into those other Asian markets. So there's no doubt it's a challenge, but I'm pretty confident that it will adapt and be there to service the projects as we need it. So yeah, Gunnar, thanks. That was
perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, moving on to the next question, which is about floating offshore wind. So yeah, what are your views on floating offshore wind? Are we close to the kind of commercial breakthrough for floating offshore wind, or is it going to take some more years? Could also be region specific. Might we see some really interesting developments in one part of the world and only a little later in other parts? Any views on floating offshore wind? And maybe this time David first and then Richard, if that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been tracking the space for a number of years, and I truly believe that we are, from a floating wind perspective, we're beyond the test projects. We're beyond the single turbine or even the small group of turbines projects. I think we are into the commercial scale. I think that's where we need to go next. And reflecting on that in Asia, I don't think you need to look at it separate to fixed floating. I think if you think of the two markets of Japan and Korea, both of those have got significant opportunity for fixed, but also floating. And I think the targets that are being set by the respective governments are ones which will stimulate both the fixed and the floating opportunity. Through 2020, actually, that's another reflection on 2020. We have seen a number of actually developers buy into certain floating technologies, become the owner or investor into those technologies. That's been an interesting move. I've always liked to be a bit more sort of technology agnostic and optimize projects for the right technology. So we'll see how that develops as those companies have made those investments. But I can see a consolidation to a core set of floating technologies, and I think the project we're not far away from seeing the first projects already being developed, but more seriously in some of those Asian markets I just referenced.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, David. I guess from an RWE perspective, we're very excited about floating. And as you said, David, seeing floating and fixed, in time we won't talk about it. It would be offshore and you'll apply whichever foundation is appropriate, whether that's fixed to the seabed or floating. We've invested in 3 demonstrator projects now, one in Denmark, one in Spain, and one in the US. Different technologies, and recognizing there will be different applications for the different technologies. So I think it's developing. I think we're getting close to the commercial stage. So I do agree, and I think some of the countries, the markets, are really helping us along that journey. I mentioned the UK, but we've now got a target for 1 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030. So that's going to stimulate some a number of commercial scale projects. In France, the Brittany South, so not the next auction, but the one after that, Brittany South, that's going to be a floating project. In Scotland, we've got a leasing round, which would be hopefully concluding in the first quarter of next year. Most of those sites are in rather deep water, so they're floating. So yeah, I can see floating becoming commercial fairly quickly. So I think it's an exciting space to be in.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks very much. That sounds indeed very exciting also for floating. Yes, so moving on to the next question, and that's actually about sort of very emerging markets, where the question is specifically about whether even markets outside of Asia, Europe, and North America might be interesting in the future. Latin America, for example, Brazil as a country that has made some interesting announcements. Any views on those sort of, yeah, maybe further away emerging markets, Latin America, even Africa potentially? Or would you say that's something we might be looking at in 20, 30 years or so, and there's enough room for development in Asia, North America, and Europe for the next couple of years? Any views on that topic?
Do you want to go first again, David?
Yeah, I can add that. Well, I mean, as I said before, there's certainly enough to go at the moment in those existing markets, but not to turn down an opportunity of further growth. Probably 2 that I would reflect on. You know, if you look at South Africa, it's clear from a wind resource perspective that there's a great opportunity for offshore wind in South Africa. Clearly, there's some sort of fundamental issues in the way the electricity system is currently operating and structured, which need to be resolved. But I think that's one for the future, the South African market. The other one, which is sort of in the Asian area, but not quite, a little bit south of here, is in Australia. So again, there's some headlines that we will have all seen about some early movement which some companies have taken to start positioning themselves in Australia. And I think it was just a few months ago where the Australian government announced some, I think it was funding to look into what offshore wind might be, for what the opportunity might be in Australia for offshore wind. So there's a sign from the government that they see some potential there. Great winds, certainly on the southern coast of Victoria. But how it competes against also strong winds onshore in Australia, I think is going to be the conundrum there, as to unlock the offshore in Australia. So they're my two observations of sort of markets we haven't talked about.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you, David. And rather than repeat everything you've said, I agree. And certainly, as a company, we're focusing our attention on the slightly more established regions, so Europe, Asia, and Americas. I think you're right. I think there is so much to go for in those 3 regions. I think these other sort of countries are less interesting for the maybe more established developers. And as you said, Australia is potentially interesting on the south coast there. I know there's the Star of the South project there, and so on. So I think where there's, you know, a grid connection, so where maybe a coal-fired power plant is going to be closing down, on the coast, and you could connect in there. There may be opportunities, but the countries you mentioned, there's so much generally land mass which works really well for onshore wind. You don't necessarily need to go offshore. So yeah, we're certainly focusing our attention on the more established areas of the globe.
Perfect.
Just
Great.
adding to that, sorry, Gunnar, just the one observation, thinking what Richard said there, and an earlier comment is, I can see, Australia's already announced some initiatives around hydrogen. So, can we see green hydrogen? So you still got that dynamic of onshore renewables versus offshore renewables. But if you really do that at scale, as a significant export product, maybe that could stimulate some form of offshore investments in Australia. So I think that's maybe the step change, which might make it viable and might make it interesting.
Great, perfect. And that actually excellently connects to the next question, which is actually about hydrogen and kind of the timeline of coupling offshore wind with hydrogen. Is that something, which is only in the very early stages? Are we going to see the first kind of at least demo projects of offshore wind powered hydrogen production anytime soon? I know, Richard, maybe RWE, I think, has just launched the interesting Aqua Ventus hydrogen project. Any views on the timeline of coupling offshore wind with hydrogen? Because there's obviously such a hype at the moment around hydrogen, but sometimes the question seems to be, is that something for next year or 2022 or so, or maybe rather something we might see around 2030 or so?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think hydrogen is going to be the game changer for the transition to net zero that I reflected on. So you're right, RWE are part of the Aqua Ventus consortium, looking at demonstrating offshore wind and hydrogen production. So produce the green electricity offshore, and then the hydrogen onshore. And there's various phases to that project where we're going to be looking at generating hydrogen offshore and piping hydrogen onto shore. So there's a number of projects that we're looking at. There's also a recent announcement. We've joined a consortium in the Netherlands as well, looking at exactly the same thing. So it's going to take a little while. I think it's going to be a bit like floating, but my hunch is it's going to go faster than floating. I think there's a real necessity to really establish this. So offshore wind is one of the perfect examples for the green electricity to power the hydrogen facilities. So certainly something RWE are very keen on. We're working with our generation business, so they've got more of the expertise on the pipeline and the hydrogen side. We've got our expertise in renewable energies. So pulling that together, something we're really keen on. So yeah, I think it's a very exciting and an essential development.
Richard, just an observation to that. I commented on the Australia one from hydrogen, but is perhaps another trigger for that shift to hydrogen as the more developed sector in Europe. Those offshore wind projects come off their long-dated contracts, which they had from from original inception. So they're now looking for what is their contracting off-taking structure post that. So we know there may be an extension, there may be corporate PPAs, but there was also potentially looking at conversion into hydrogen. So maybe that could be a trend in Europe initially.
No, absolutely. Very, very good point, David. Yeah.
Perfect, thanks. So actually the next question is about some of the challenges that we might actually face in some of those new markets. We've seen that there are plenty of new markets around the world who are keen to build offshore wind. But what do you think might be some of the challenges or obstacles we face in those new markets? Can it be some regulatory uncertainties or potential kind of lack of supply chain or local content requirements? So any views on things that could actually kind of limit the growth that we were looking at, or that we hope to see in the future. Any thoughts on challenges or obstacles in some of the new upcoming offshore wind markets? Maybe David first and then Richard.
Yep, absolutely. So supply chain, I think we've talked about supply chain earlier, so that is a challenge into some of those new markets. Linked to that, I think to lower the costs, so the transition from an early market to lower the costs, so we can deliver offshore wind at market competitive rates. So we know we've all plotted the graphs as to how fast that happened in Europe. So the question is, how can some of these new markets go through that same sort of learning cycle, but hopefully on a much shorter time frame. So we can see, and we all as an industry want to see offshore wind delivered at the lowest cost possible to make it competitive against the alternative, and that in itself makes it a sustainable industry. So that's one challenge. How do we support the industry to lower the costs? And as you said, Gunnar, that could come from clear policy directions, or could come from supply chain. The other one, just a couple of other reflections before handing to Richard. The other one is in a number of the Asian markets, particularly grid infrastructure. So grid infrastructure is a real challenge to the uptake of more offshore wind projects. Some cases there's sort of structural inefficiencies in the way the grid is set up today. So I see that as an area where, again, is the burden of further grid infrastructure going to be placed onto the underlying offshore wind projects, or is there some investment that can be made at a sort of a macro level to support the upgrading of the grid? And then the other challenge is, it's because offshore wind is early in its migration. It's winning the support of local communities. You know, that we don't have any project unless we gain the support of the incumbent, the local stakeholders, and whether they be the fishermen, which we've all heard the challenges of gaining their support in a number of markets, and certainly I see that in Asia all the time. So that's a challenge. We need to take them on a learning curve. We need to explain to them why they can continue to prosper in their local communities, while offshore wind is a partner to them in their community, bringing benefits. So that's the other challenge, and it's something which we've seen as we've tried to develop our project here in Japan, making sure we partner with the right companies, so that we through their support can engage in the local communities. So they're my few observations, Richard. Hope I left some for you.
I agree with all of those. I think that's really good. I think when it comes to new markets, I think a lot of it is policy. You know, every market does it a bit differently. So for a new market, for the policy makers, they do have quite a job trying to work out what their right policy is. And I know, a plug for WFO here, they do some great work in trying to help government departments understand what works, what doesn't work in current markets. So I think getting the policy right, and I agree with the other points you made, David. I think actually I'm going to reflect on existing markets, if I may, Gunnar. So massive growth, but that's a challenge in existing markets, and for a couple of reasons. David mentioned the grid in new markets, but in existing markets, the grid is an issue. We've seen, many of our UK projects, the grid connections are much later than we would like them to be. I can develop an awful lot more offshore wind much faster than the grid is available. And that's going to be a problem. So many of our grid connection dates are the wrong side of 2030 for countries, and the UK specifically, to hit their target. So onshore grid reinforcement to enable offshore wind, I think, is critical in existing and new markets. And then I guess as the intensity of offshore wind increases, consenting an offshore wind farm, or permitting, so from the environmental side, can become more of a challenge. So the cumulative impacts, you know, the offshore in the UK, 10 gigawatts moving to 40 gigawatts. That is an awful lot of cumulative impact on birds, wildlife, and so on. So there's an awful lot more work to do to make sure that we understand those impacts, they're managed, and we're doing the right thing. So yeah, they're the areas I think I would touch on.
Perfect, great, thanks very much. And yes, I think the next question relates to something David said in his opening statement, which is about some of the new players that we see in the offshore wind industry, specifically the oil and gas companies. So taking into consideration the fact that we do see more and more interest from the likes of Shell, BP, Total, do you think those new companies are going to change the offshore wind industry significantly in any way? Or is it going to be pretty much the same as it has been for the past 5-10 years or so? Or are they maybe going to make a difference in the floating sector, which could be something they are specifically interested in, given their floating oil and gas know-how? Any views on those new players, the oil and gas companies specifically that we see in the offshore wind industry? Maybe again, David first and then Richard.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation, Gunnar. I think, as I said earlier, it's I think competition is great. Competition will drive innovation and drive costs down. And repeating myself from before, I think that creates the sustainable industry which we want. So clearly, there's a whole raft of experience which the oil and gas in particular, with their offshore experience, will be able to bring to the sector. So that they're bringing further capital into the industry, which fundamentally is a positive. Will they change? Is it going to get more crowded? Yes. Is it going to squeeze some people out? Potentially. Maybe those at the smaller end of this spectrum of developers, maybe they're going to find themselves squeezed out of the industry as it becomes increasingly competitive. So I think that's the challenge I would see as more organizations come into the space, and particularly those oil and gas majors, as you say. But yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I'd agree with those, David. Absolutely, there's plenty to go round here. You know, in Europe, 300 gigawatts by 2050. There's plenty. We've got lots of opportunity. So having more players in the market, like you, David, it's not something that worries me. I'd welcome them in. I guess they are new to the market. Those of us who've been around a long time, we made mistakes in the early days. We learned the hard way. Our industry can't really afford to have mistakes and problems, and particularly in new markets, that wouldn't be a good signal to governments if the first projects are late and over budget and everything else. So there's a lot of expertise oil and gas companies, for example, can bring, but I think for the early projects they will need some experienced developers alongside them. Competition generally brings down price. I don't disagree with that, although oil and gas companies traditionally might be used to higher margins than we're used to in offshore wind. So that would be interesting to see how things develop with the tight margins that we have today. And rightly so, we're driving down the levelized cost of energy from offshore wind. We're now cost competitive, but the margins are tight. So yeah, I look forward to new entrants coming in and seeing the market expand. There's enough to go around, that's for sure.
Great, perfect. And I think we might have time for one or two more questions. So next question, quite interesting on some of the lessons learned actually from Europe. Because as you said, in Europe, I mean, it took us 20 to 30 years to really get to where we are now with a flourishing offshore wind industry in many countries. But of course, we expect markets in Asia and North America to do that kind of development much quicker. And what would you say are some of the most important lessons learned that players or even regulators or policymakers in Asia and North America can take from the European offshore wind experience to really make sure that they can kind of ideally jump the cost curve and really ramp up their local offshore wind industries and their developments much quicker than the 20 to 30 years it has taken the European markets to really reach the level that we currently have. Any views on those key lessons learned for the new markets? Maybe this time Richard first, then David.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Gunnar. Yeah, making sure that in new markets we're taking all of our lessons learned with us is critical. I have absolutely no doubt that in new markets we're not starting from the same base that we started in Europe. You mentioned the cost of energy from offshore wind has come down to some really impressive levels. Well, we're going to start at somewhere close to those levels, I think, in new markets. We're not starting from where we were. Some of that's just the technology, much larger, more efficient turbines, massively bring down the cost of energy, and we'll be using those turbines in new markets. I think generally, it is experienced players who have learned their trade in Europe are doing business in the less established markets. So they will bring with them their know-how, their policies, their procedures, importantly, their people with the knowledge and systems for making sure all of the lessons learned are in place and we don't make those errors again. So for me, it's just about making sure that we are really competent. I think if it was any advice for governments in new markets, it would be not to push the localization agenda too hard and too fast. Everybody I mentioned wants a factory in their country, but if every factory is a brand new factory and they've never done it before, there's going to be challenges. I've bought monopiles from China once before, and it's the first time the factory had ever made anything round, and they weren't very good at it. They weren't round, and we learned the hard way. So there's definitely something about making sure that we use the experience, the knowledge, established manufacturers, and really work with the local supply chain, local manufacturers, to really help them ramp up at a sensible rate, that we're not introducing too much risk into our new projects. So they're my initial thoughts.
Just to agree with that, Richard, and just maybe a couple of observations. My lesson learned, repeating what I said before, targets. The lesson learned as a government is set the clear targets, and then that's what we said before, stimulates the investment in the supply chain, the signal to the international developers to come into the market, and they can establish themselves. So the key lesson learned as a message to any government is set clear targets. Maybe two things we haven't talked about so much so far. The lesson learned around safety. When you're doing something for the first time, we want to make sure this industry is remains best in class in terms of everything we do around health and safety. It is a dangerous industry we're in. We do dangerous things. Offshore, by its nature, is a dangerous area. So I think I would encourage the best in practice around safety to be taken across into new markets. And then something else we haven't touched on is actually operations. At the end of the day, these projects become operating assets that generate electricity, and maybe some of these new markets haven't really thought about that yet because they're at the start of the journey. But I think it's never too early to start thinking about how you're going to operate and keep the projects or the turbine spinning. So I think that's the I'd like to suggest we take across as a lesson learned.
Perfect, great, and yeah, really like the kind of recommendation that it's all about targets. And a great recommendation for policymakers. Perfect. Yeah, I think actually that greatly brings us to an end of this fascinating discussion right on time. Yes, so thank you very much, David and Richard, for your time and for your thoughts on this very eventful year. But yeah, I think it really, for offshore wind, it really does look promising and extremely exciting on a global scale with all those new markets coming up in Asia, Europe, North America, and even beyond that. So yeah, I think looking absolutely fascinating. So thanks very much again, Richard and David, and also thanks to the audience for dialing in into today's webinar. And yeah, please make sure to join us again in January next year for the next WFO webinar. And yes, I think that just leaves me with thanking our audience for joining, and again, Richard and David for being the speakers today. And yeah, have a great rest of the day and all the best for 2021. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Bye
all.
then.